Hey guys, so today we are going to learn how to use the constraint layout. The constraint layout was very recently added in Android Studio 2.2, and if you're familiar with Android layouts, you might think that it's kind of similar to relative layout, and in fact it kind of is. However, there are some very different ways in which you use them, and hopefully you find it a little bit more easy to use. What really is nice about it is that it makes it really easy to make layouts that scale on different screen sizes, and again you'll be seeing that later on in this video. So first, let's get started. So right here, I essentially just created a new project. Haven't done anything to it, and by default you'll notice that it gives a relative layout to start off. However, we want to make it a constraint layout. So the way you can do that, there's a couple of ways, but I find one of the easiest ways to do it is just actually right click on the screen and say convert relative layout to constraint layout and say OK. What's kind of nice about this is actually, okay, so right here it's saying that we have to add a certain library. Just say OK. What's nice about doing that is if you've already made layouts using relative layouts or linear layouts, you can use that convert button to essentially change it into a constraint layout. So it's telling us to just build and refresh, so we'll do that. But yeah, so you don't have to spend hopefully too much time in remaking layouts that you've made in the past. In theory, clicking this button that we just did should allow a very easy transformation from one of those other layout types to constraint layout. But anyway, yeah, so we did that, and here we are. We now have a constraint layout. And yeah, so let's kind of get started. We'll delete this. So the thing about a constraint layout is, as mentioned earlier, is it kind of feels like a relative layout. So what we mean by that is you're just dragging, let's say for example, you're dragging this button onto the screen. Now you have a button on the screen, but really the difference between a constraint layout and a relative layout is these things called constraints. And I like to think of them almost as rubber bands in a way, because that's kind of what they are. So you see on each of the four sides there are these things, and essentially if you take one of these and drag it to the side, you're essentially creating a constraint. So actually if you click on this red thing, it deletes it. So let's just do that again. We have a button here. We're going to constrain the left side of the button to the left side of the screen, and you saw how it kind of like snaps to it. That's what I kind of think of as like a rubber band. And the reason it's like that is because now this side of this view, this button, is essentially like snapped or constrained to the left side of the screen. Now, the way the rubber band intuition really comes in handy, or really is exemplified, is if now you took the right side and you constrained it to the right side of the screen. Now it's essentially like in the middle, and you see there's almost like rubber bands on both sides. So I mean, it might not be the most proper way to think about it with rubber bands, but I don't know, I feel like as if it helps exemplify kind of how it works. So now that you have a slightly better intuition as to how a constraint layout works, let's get into something slightly more complicated. So let's say, for example, we're making a sign-in page. So what all does a sign-in page have? So first it has a edit text where they can enter in their username. So let's just put this on the screen. There'll be a second one for a password. And then there will be some sort of button also on the screen. Let's put this here. Okay, so we can make this edit text. We'll take out the text there and we'll say the hint is username. Here, the hint for this one is password. And then we'll make this one say sign in. There you go. Okay. So now we have these three things on the screen. So, let's say we want these fields to be in the center of the screen. So, we could just drag them all to the center. And that looks great, right? Now, what happens when the user rotates the screen sideways? Let's look. Here. Or things aren't exactly centered in the screen anymore, are they? That's because we didn't actually create any constraints. So let's go back to the vertical view, and I'll kind of explain a little bit better. Zoom out a bit. So here we go. So the thing is, we want these to be centered in all possible layouts, and that's essentially what a constraint layout lets you do. Because now when we actually center it using constraints, we are putting everything, well, first of all, by doing this, we're essentially creating constraints such that these views are always in the middle of the screen. Before we had these constraints, before we actually like connected these, each of these views to the sides of the screens, these views are kind of just on the screen in some like position. And when you rotate it sideways, that position really didn't change. So that's why they were offset. If you remember when we rotated sideways, they did not stay at the center of the screen. They were still like in this corner. However, now that we've created these constraints, now no matter what screen size it is, you see they're kind of staying in the middle of the screen. And that was really the goal. So the thing is, you don't only have to bind stuff to the sides of the screen. You can also constrain stuff to other views. So for example, let's say we want this button to be aligned with these, the left side, or actually let's do right side of these. You take the right side of the button and you put it right to the side of that view, and there we go. So no matter where you move this now, you see the button underneath it moves, the button moves with it as well, because this button is constrained to the right side of this view. So let's say you want them all to move together. You simply constrain them both to this one. And actually, so the reason this is actually happening is because there's a margin. And we'll be talking about that shortly, but actually, let's just, it's because of that side. Okay, there we go. So it wasn't because of margin. But anyway, we'll be covering that soon. But you see, basically, now they're all binded. Both of these, this edit text and this button, are binded to this edit text right here. So now when this one moves, all of them move. And to make it even better, we can bring it closer like this. And there we go. Now they are all moving together. But yeah, so that's the powerful thing. You can essentially create it such that, well, you can bind different views to each other so that they all move together. And that's how you create layouts that scale to different sizes. So now, no matter what size the screen is, these will all be placed relative to each other in the same exact position relative to one another. That's important because if they were just in the same position, it would not look as nice. For example, if we delete these constraints, now this is just kind of free floating. We put this here. Or actually, let's put it in the center again. When you rotate the screen again, they didn't stay in the center. That's why when we constrain it to the side, now they stay in the center. And that's important. I know I'm kind of repeating the same thing over and over, but that's really important because if you see, no matter how you change the size of the screen, the views stay in the middle, and that is very, very important. There are a few more concepts that are important to know before you've fully mastered constraint layout. One of them is making these views fill up the entire width of the screen. So right now what you can do is you can adjust their width like this. Just grab the size and expand it. But as you adjust the screen size, this didn't really grow any larger. Let's say you want this edit text to fill up the entire width of the screen. How can you do that? It's actually really simple. So if you open up the properties on the side, all you have to do is essentially set the width. I know it seems kind of strange. You set it to 0, and now it's filled up the entire width of the screen. Well, why is that? It's because the width is not actually 0. When you set it to 0, it's basically saying it does not have a fixed width, and it should follow the constraints. And because the constraints have been set to be on both sides of the screen, it's essentially stretching until it meets those constraints and is now filled up to both sides of the screen. I hope that made sense. But basically, we'll do it again. But before we do that, you might notice that if we could yeah, there we go. You see how it's not exactly all the way on the side of the screen? There's actually a margin right there. That's just because we have these margins set right here. So if you set this to 0, it's now all the way on the side of the screen. And likewise, you could do it on this side. It's now all the way on that side of the screen as well. So now when we zoom back out, now it's truly filling the entire width of the screen. And as you adjust the size, this one scales dynamically to fit the entire width of the screen. So that's one thing. There were two things in there. There was margin. So if we set the left to be 32 margin, you'll see now there's actually a margin on the side. And then there was the concept of actually making it fit the width of the screen. Now there's another thing we can do there. Let's say we actually want we want both of these this edit text and this button to be on the same line, and then we want the button to be fixed width, but the edit text to fill the remaining size of the screen. So how can we do that? First, let's actually cancel all the constraints that we have. So you basically delete a constraint by clicking the circle, and it's gone. So we'll put them on the same line. We have some more constraints here, but okay, here we go. Delete that constraint. Okay, so we'll put them on the same line, and we will essentially. Okay, there we go. So first we'll create a constraint binding this one to the side, and then we're going to create a constraint binding this edit text to here and to the left here. And now, because the width is 0, you saw how it filled up the entire width of the screen. Because, by setting the width to be 0 and constraining this edit text to both sides, it's filling up all the space in between. And because we constrained this edit text to the right of this button, it's basically filling up all the space between this button and the left side of the screen. So as we make the button bigger, this one scales correspondingly. So it's filling up the remaining size of the screen, just like that. Pretty straightforward. And of course, as you adjust the size of the screen, the width, this edit text is still filling up the remaining space, and this sign in button is fixed with, and they are on the same line. One more thing that's kind of interesting. Let's delete all the constraints. Basically, we had it where, let's say we want to center something directly in the middle of the screen. We'll create constraints on all sides of the screen. And you might, actually, why is this? Okay, it has a margin of 336. Let's set all of these to 0. All margins to 0. There we go. Okay, so there we go. Now this button is directly in the center of the screen. Now, we've created this constraint, but you see how it says 50% everywhere? So it says 50% there. This is 50%. Essentially, you can give it a weight. Like, you can make it say be 75% from the left and 25% on the right. And that's exactly what we did here. So these sliders, it was by default at 50, so it's exactly in the middle of the screen. But you can essentially adjust the weight from each side. So going back to the rubber band analogy, it's like adjusting how strong each rubber band is. Before we get to an example of creating an entire layout from scratch, there's one more thing I wanted to show you. And that is something called, it's actually right here. It's called inferring constraints. Infer constraints right there. And essentially what it does is it is able to predict what constraints you want to make based on how you make the layout. And the best way to kind of understand it is just to do it, actually see it work. So let's go back to that example of just putting a button in the exact middle of the screen, right there. There we go. So we have a button in the middle of the screen, right? So as you adjust, if you remember, it didn't really move. It didn't really stay in the middle of the screen. It just stayed in that position, which is not in the middle of every single screen. So let's go back to where it is in the middle of the screen. So, it kind of makes sense just looking at this layout that you wanted in the middle of the screen. So that's kind of what Infer Layout is able to do. So when you click Infer Layout, it actually intelligently predicts, what constraints you want. And it predicted that you want this one to be in the middle of the screen. So it actually automatically created these constraints. So now as you adjust the size of the screen, it stays in the middle of the screen. And that's exactly what Infer layouts did. So now that you've seen how a constraint layout works, let's do a slightly more complicated example. And actually for this one, we'll turn on the blueprint mode, just so you can actually see how it looks in both. In case you haven't seen blueprint mode, well, you're about to see it, and it's pretty cool. So let's do an example where we're essentially creating a profile screen that has your image at the top. It has a name and email, and then a checkbox next to the name and email, indicating, I don't know, some setting. This is just an example, so it can be whatever you want. So first, let's put the image view at the top. So we will go to image view. We'll just put one on the screen. We'll just select the default, Android icon. And we want the image view to fill up the entire screen. So if you remember, we'll essentially create, or not the entire screen, the entire width. So if you remember how to do that, we're essentially creating the constraints on both sides and setting the width to be 0. We also don't want the margins, so let's just get rid of the margins here. In case actually let's, before we do that, let's, constrain to top as well, no margin. And let's give it a height of, I don't know, 150 dp. There you go. In case you couldn't figure out, actually, the constraint layout is essentially, not the constraint layout, the blueprint mode is essentially just a simplified version of, the actual layout. So you can kind of see how it looks. And that's exactly what a blueprint is, right? It's essentially just a cleaner way of looking at the, kind of like how your, layout is laid out. Okay. So, we have a text view that can be, we'll say, name. Another one for will be email. And now they'll have one that, those are kind of like headers. So now they'll actually have one, let's zoom in a bit. So now they'll actually have one, there we go. So now this one will actually have their name. So let's say the name is Joe. And then over here, their email can be, I'm not sure, what should we call it? Email can be joe@joe.com. He really likes his name. So Joe really likes his name. Okay. Now we also want a, let's say checkbox next to each, actually let's not do a checkbox. Let's delete that. Let's do a, where's the switch? Switch, there we go. Okay, so we'll put that right there on each row. We don't need to have text, so let's get rid of the text. We just want the switch, right? And we want another, we'll do one switch, one checkbox. How about that? Keep it interesting. So then we'll put another one here. We'll get rid of the text. And this is kind of where blueprint mode is nice. So if you see, we'll go over here, look at a simplified version of it. We'll drag and drop these. Okay, so we made that. We haven't really created any constraints. Obviously, could look better, but let's first see how it'll scale. We'll get rid of the blueprint for now. As you adjust it, didn't really adjust so nicely, right? Let's go back and create constraints now. So we'll go back to the original portrait layout, and first let's see what auto constraint does. We'll turn back on blueprint mode, or have both. So we'll click on Infer Constraints, and there we go. It created some constraints. Let's see how it looks. So we will adjust this layout, or the width. It actually adjusted pretty nicely, right? That was actually pretty good, honestly. Now let's just make a few adjustments here. So let's say we want, these, there we go. It's not panning. Okay, yeah, we want these fields to take up the entire width. So how up to these switches and checkbox, right? How can we do that? We'll essentially create a constraint going from right there to the switch, right? And now the width will be 0. So in reality, it's not really 0, but it's just filling up the remaining space. And we'll do the same for this this email as well. Width can be 0. Okay, there you go. this looks much nicer now because as you zoom out, as you adjust this field will the size will adjust accordingly. We have the image view, stays the full width of the screen at the top. The button, maybe we'll have the these also be constrained to the right side, just so there's more maybe actually. So you see how these kind of like offset a bit, like they're binded on the left side. They're not. So the switch is not exactly centered underneath the checkbox is not exactly centered underneath the switch. It's kind of left justified. You can right justify it just by constraining the right side to the right side of the switch, and now it's exactly centered. So again, I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, um, and I personally, feel as if the best way to learn a constraint layout is just to practice it yourself. I mean, it's it's a lot of just trial and kind of understanding how things work, understanding what exactly it is to create this constraint, and once you understand it, you'll kind of see why it's so much more powerful than linear layout or relative layout, and it really, really allows for clean user interfaces to be made easily. The concept of a constraint, it's again, you just have to kind of play around and be able to understand what will happen when you constrain one thing to another. But once you get a hang of that, you'll see how much easier it is to create these layouts that scale on different screen sizes, and they just look much nicer. So I hope this video was useful, and if you have any questions, please leave any comments. Thanks.